On the morning of June 6, 1944, thousands of American, British, and Canadian soldiers climbed down rope nets into landing craft and began the crossing toward the beaches of Normandy. Most of them had no idea what was waiting for them. Those who survived would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe it. And most of them said there were no words adequate to the task. What was waiting for them, dug into concrete positions above the waterline, was a weapon that changed the mathematics of the landing entirely. Before getting into what happened on June 6th, it is worth understanding the weapon at the center of this story. Because the MG42 was not simply a machine gun, it was a fundamentally different kind of problem than anything most Allied soldiers had encountered before. The MG42, Maschinengewehr 42, was introduced into German service in 1942 and was, by the time of the Normandy landings in 1944, one of the most technically advanced infantry weapons in any army in the world. It was chambered for the standard 7.92 by 57mm Mauser cartridge, the same round used in German rifles, which simplified logistics in the field. It weighed approximately 11.5 kilograms without its mount, light enough to be carried by a single soldier, though it was typically operated by a crew. The rate of fire was the defining characteristic. The MG42 could fire at a rate of between 1,200 and 1,500 rounds per minute, depending on the specific variant and operating conditions. To put that in context, the American M1919 Browning machine gun that Allied forces used fired at approximately 400 to 600 rounds per minute. The British Bren gun, the standard light machine gun of Commonwealth forces, fired at around 500 rounds per minute. The MG42 fired at more than double the rate of most of the weapons on the other side of the beach. The sound it produced was distinctive enough that Allied soldiers gave it its own name. They called it the buzzsaw, or in some accounts, Hitler's zipper, because the rate of fire was so high that the individual shots blurred together into a continuous tearing sound, rather than the distinct mechanical rhythm of other machine guns. Veterans who survived encounters with it described the sound as something that stayed with them for the rest of their lives, a sound entirely unlike anything else on the battlefield. The weapon was fed by a belt of ammunition. A standard belt held 50 rounds, and belts could be linked together for sustained fire. The barrel heated rapidly at that rate of fire and had to be changed frequently. But the MG42 was designed with quick barrel changes in mind, and a trained crew could swap the barrel in under 10 seconds. This meant that the sustained fire capability of a well-supplied position was effectively continuous. A single MG42, properly positioned and adequately supplied with ammunition, could cover an enormous field of fire and sustain that coverage for as long as the ammunition and barrel supply held out. On the beaches of Normandy, in the hands of experienced German gunners in concrete and stone fortifications overlooking narrow strips of sand with almost no cover, this was the central fact of the morning of June 6, 1944. Understanding what it was capable of is the only way to understand what the men who crossed those beaches actually walked into, and which beach of the 5 that were attacked that morning produced the most concentrated and devastating use of the weapon. Of the 5 beaches attacked on D-Day, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, Omaha was the deadliest. The reasons for this were multiple and have been studied extensively in the decades since, but the central factor was the terrain and the concentration of German defensive positions. Omaha Beach stretched for approximately 6 kilometers along the Normandy coast between the towns of Vieilleville-sur-Mer and Colleville-sur-Mer. Behind the beach rose a series of bluffs, elevated ground ranging from approximately 30 to 45 meters high, that provided German defenders with a commanding view of the entire beach below. The beach itself was narrow, offering very little space between the waterline and the base of the bluffs, and it was overlooked by a series of carefully constructed defensive positions that the Germans had spent years improving. The American forces assigned to Omaha were the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and the 29th Infantry Division, which had not seen previous combat. Together, they were to clear the beach, scale the bluffs, and open exits through which vehicles and follow-on forces could move inland. They were told that the German defenses had been substantially degraded by the preceding bombing campaign. They had not been. The bombing had missed almost entirely, dropping its payload too far inland to affect the fortifications on the bluffs. The German unit defending Omaha was primarily the 352nd Infantry Division, a full-strength combat division transferred to the Normandy coast in March 1944, whose presence on the bluffs was not known to most of the men who landed that morning. Allied intelligence had identified the weaker 716th Infantry Division as the primary defender of this sector, and the discovery that this was wrong came at a severe cost. The defensive positions that mattered most on Omaha were the Widerstandsnester, fortified fighting positions built into the natural terrain of the bluffs and the draws, the ravines that cut through the elevated ground, representing the only routes up from the beach. There were 16 of these positions along the Omaha sector, connected by trenches and communication lines. The MG42 positions within these nests had been sited with care. The gunners had fields of fire covering not just the beach directly in front of them, but, in many cases, the beach at an angle, enfilading fire directed along the length of the line of troops rather than straight into them. This was the most effective way to employ a machine gun against troops in a linear formation, because each round that missed its first target continued toward the next man in the line. The men coming off the landing craft at Omaha were walking into interlocking fields of enfilading fire from positions they often could not see, on a beach with almost no natural cover. What happened in the first 2 hours of the Omaha landing was a catastrophe that went beyond anything the planners had prepared for, and the MG42 positions on the bluffs were the primary mechanism of it. The first wave of American troops hit Omaha Beach at approximately 6:30 in the morning. The men inside the landing craft had been at sea since before dawn, cold, wet, and in many cases severely seasick from the rough channel crossing. When the front ramps dropped, what met the men who stepped out was the full weight of German defensive fire, rifle fire, mortar fire, artillery fire, and above all the continuous tearing sound of MG42s sweeping the waterline. Many men were hit before they reached the shore. The landing craft dropped them in water that was, in places, deeper than expected. Some stepped off the ramp into water over their heads, and the weight of their equipment, often exceeding 30 kilograms, made it impossible to swim. Men drowned before the machine guns could reach them. Others were hit in the water and went under. The margin between the waterline and the sand was, in those first minutes, the most dangerous stretch of ground on Earth. Those who reached the sand found very little protection. The beach had some defensive obstacles, metal and wooden barriers the Germans had constructed to impede landing craft, and small ridges of shingle, the coarse gravel found on many channel beaches. The shingle provided minimal cover against direct fire, but nothing adequate against enfilading fire from the angles the German gunners were using. The soldiers who made it to the base of the bluffs were temporarily sheltered from the direct fire of the positions above them, but getting there meant crossing the entire width of the beach under sustained machine gun fire. For many men, that crossing was simply not possible in those first hours. One of the most important first-hand records of what the morning looked like comes from a senior American officer who observed the first wave from his position offshore. He described a beach covered with dead and wounded men, with soldiers pinned down behind whatever cover they could find, with almost no movement toward the German positions. He used language that conveyed not just the tactical situation, but the human reality of it. The sense that what was happening on that beach was not a battle in any normal sense, but something closer to a systematic destruction of men who had no adequate answer to what was being done to them. The casualty figures for Omaha that morning reflect this. Estimates vary because the chaos of the first hours made accurate record-keeping impossible, but historians generally place American casualties at Omaha on June 6th at somewhere between 2,000 and 4,700 killed, wounded, or missing. Of the 5 beaches, Omaha accounted for the vast majority of Allied casualties on D-Day. Some units lost more than half their men in the first hour. The scale of that loss, concentrated in such a short time and in such a confined space, was produced by a relatively small number of German defenders, because the MG42 positions were that effective. The men behind the MG42s on the bluffs above Omaha were not a monolithic group. They ranged in experience, age, and background, and understanding who they were is part of understanding what happened that morning. The 352nd Infantry Division, the primary formation defending the Omaha sector, had been formed in late 1943 from a combination of veterans of the Eastern Front and newly trained recruits. The The veterans brought combat experience of a kind that the Allied soldiers they would face on June 6th largely did not have. The Eastern Front was the largest and most devastating land conflict of the entire war, and the men who had served there had seen levels of sustained combat that shaped them in specific ways. The machine gun crews were typically 2 to 3 men, a gunner who operated the weapon, an assistant who managed the belt feed and assisted with barrel changes, and sometimes a third man who carried additional ammunition and helped with positioning. These crews trained together and operated as a unit. The synchronization between a gunner and his assistant was important for maintaining sustained fire, particularly the barrel changes that were necessary every few hundred rounds. The positions they occupied had been prepared over months. Some of the concrete bunkers on the bluffs above Omaha had been under construction for years as part of the Atlantic Wall, the defensive fortification system that the Germans had been building along the coast of occupied Europe since 1942. The positions were oriented to take advantage of the terrain, with firing slits angled to cover the beach and the draws, and in some cases designed to make them invisible from the sea. The gunners in those positions on the morning of June 6th knew the ground in front of them in the way that soldiers know ground they have occupied for months. They had pre-registered their firing positions, identified specific points on the beach, and calculated the exact adjustments needed to hit them, which meant that when the landing craft appeared, the gunners were not guessing. They were firing at targets they had already calculated. Some of the German soldiers defending Omaha were teenagers who had been in the military for only a short time. Others were seasoned men in their 30s who had been fighting since 1939. The psychological experience of that morning was, for many of them, unlike anything they had encountered before. Not because they were facing an overwhelming force, but because the inverse was true. The defensive positions, the weapon, and the terrain were working exactly as designed, and the men on the beach below were unable to stop them. Several German accounts from that morning describe a specific and uncomfortable reality. Some of the men in the defensive positions found the experience deeply disturbing even as they continued to fire, firing a machine gun at men who cannot effectively return fire, who are falling in large numbers, who are visibly suffering. This was not a clean or abstract thing. The accounts from the German side do not describe detachment or indifference. They describe men doing what the situation required while carrying a full awareness of what it meant. What ultimately broke the German positions on Omaha was not an overwhelming frontal assault, but something smaller, more costly, and more desperate than that. By mid-morning on June 6th, the situation at Omaha was sufficiently dire that senior American commanders offshore were considering whether to abandon the landing and redirect follow-on forces to Utah Beach, where the Americans had landed with far fewer casualties. That decision was not made, but the fact that it was being discussed gives a sense of how close to catastrophe the morning had come. What began to change things was not a coordinated plan, but the individual actions of small groups of men, often led by junior officers and sergeants, who found ways to move off the beach and into the draws that led up the bluffs. One of the most significant actions was led by Brigadier General Norman Cota, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division. Cota moved along the beach under fire, gathering pinned-down soldiers and pushing them forward. He is reported to have told soldiers that they were going to die on the beach unless they moved, and that the only way off was through the German positions. His presence and willingness to move in the open had a galvanizing effect on the men around him. Similar actions were being taken by other officers and sergeants across the length of Omaha. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment had been essentially destroyed in the first minutes. Landing craft came in directly in front of a German position, and the men coming off the ramps were cut down almost immediately. The survivors, a small number, managed to reach cover and eventually began to move. The Rangers who landed at Pointe de Hoc, a promontory to the west of Omaha with identified German gun positions, climbed the cliff under fire and reached the top, only to find the heavy guns had already been moved inland. They located them in an orchard, disabled them, and held their position against counterattacks for 2 days, sustaining severe casualties. The Navy also played a critical role. Several destroyers moved in extremely close to shore, in some cases with their keels scraping the bottom, to bring their guns to bear on German positions at close range. The fire support they provided helped suppress some of the MG42 positions long enough for infantry to advance. Each German position had to be approached individually, typically by a small group with grenades and rifles, working to get to an angle from which they could attack from the flank. By early afternoon, exits from Omaha had been forced open. By nightfall, the Americans held a narrow strip of ground above the bluffs. The cost had been enormous, but the beach had been secured. The contrast between what happened at Omaha and what happened at the other 4 beaches on June 6th is striking, and it helps clarify exactly how significant the terrain and the defensive positions at Omaha were to the casualty figures. At Utah Beach, to the west of Omaha, the American 4th Infantry Division landed with much lighter resistance. A combination of factors contributed to this. The current carried the landing craft slightly off course, which meant they came ashore at a part of the beach that was less heavily defended than the intended landing zone. The terrain behind Utah was also more favorable than the bluffs at Omaha, offering exits that did not require scaling elevated ground under fire. American casualties at Utah on June 6th were approximately 197 killed and wounded, a fraction of the Omaha figure. At Gold, Juno, and Sword, the British and Canadian beaches to the east, the resistance was serious but more variable. The terrain at these beaches was generally less severe than Omaha, with lower ground behind the waterline, though German fortifications were still present and still dangerous. The 3rd Canadian Division at Juno faced significant resistance at certain points, particularly at Courcelles-sur-Mer and Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, where German fortifications had to be cleared by infantry fighting at close range. British and Canadian casualties across the 3 beaches on June 6th totaled approximately 3,300 to 4,000 killed, wounded, and missing. MG42 positions existed on all of the beaches. The difference at Omaha was the combination of the weapon with terrain that provided no cover and positions that had been sited to achieve maximum coverage of the beach. At Gold, Juno, and Sword, the lower ground and in some cases the presence of seaside structures gave attacking soldiers at least some ability to approach the German positions from cover. At Omaha, that option barely existed. The disparity in casualties between the beaches was not a reflection of how hard the soldiers fought. The men at Omaha were not less capable than the men at Utah or Gold. They were facing a situation in which the defensive advantages were more concentrated and more difficult to overcome, and in which a relatively small number of well-positioned weapons with an extraordinary rate of fire had an effect that was disproportionate to the size of the defending force. The MG42 did not disappear from the battlefield after June 6, 1944. It remained in service with German forces through the rest of the war in Europe and was encountered by Allied soldiers from Normandy through to the final battles in Germany in the spring of 1945. The weapon became something of an obsession for Allied military planners and tacticians who spent considerable effort studying how to counter it. The standard advice given to soldiers in training was to move in short rushes, to expose oneself for the minimum possible time during any advance, to use every available piece of cover, and to attempt to attack machine gun positions from the flank or rear rather than directly into the field of fire. This was advice that was easier to give in a training environment than to apply on a beach with no cover and fire coming from multiple directions. American and British forces developed and refined their tactics for dealing with MG42 positions through the fighting in Normandy and beyond. The hedgerow country of the Norman interior, the bocage with its dense network of earthen field boundaries that provided cover and concealment, actually gave attacking soldiers more options than the open beach had, though it created its own tactical difficulties. The fighting through the bocage in the weeks after D-Day was slow and costly, and the MG42 remained a constant factor in it. The weapon also influenced post-war military design in specific and documented ways. After the war, West Germany, which joined NATO and began rearming in the mid-1950s, retained the MG42 in a modified form as the MG3, chambered for the NATO standard 7.62 by 51 mm cartridge. The MG3 is still in service with German and several other NATO armies today, more than 80 years after the original design was developed. The basic mechanism, the quick change barrel, the high rate of fire, all of it survived into the modern era because it worked. The United States military, having encountered the MG42 on the beaches of Normandy and in every subsequent engagement in the European theater, formally studied it and incorporated lessons from it into the development of post-war American machine gun design. The M60 machine gun, which became the standard American infantry machine gun from the late 1950s through the 1980s, incorporated several features influenced by the MG42, including the belt feed system and the quick-change barrel mechanism. The weapon shaped the day that changed the course of the war, and then it continued shaping military thinking for generations afterward. The casualty figures from D-Day are significant, but they are also abstract in the way that large numbers tend to become. What they represent in human terms is something that the veterans who survived that morning spent decades trying to convey. The men who landed at Omaha and survived described an experience that was, in many respects, incomprehensible to those who had not been there. The combination of the physical conditions, cold water, heavy equipment, seasickness, confusion about where they were on the beach, with the sustained and seemingly unstoppable fire from the bluffs, produced a state in many soldiers that went beyond ordinary fear. Men described freezing in place, unable to move. They described taking cover behind the bodies of men who had already been killed. They described following the men in front of them into the water and watching them go down, and then continuing forward because there was nothing else to do. The men who held the positions on the bluffs carried their own version of that morning. The accounts that exist from German veterans of the Omaha defense describe the same surreal quality from the other direction. The scale of what was happening on the beach below them, the sustained nature of the fire, the awareness that what they were doing was causing casualties at a rate that was very difficult to process in real time. After the war, some of those German veterans described a specific moment that several of them identified independently, a point at which the volume of men coming off the landing craft was so great that the fire from the defensive positions could not keep pace with it. The beach was filling faster than the gunners could clear it. That was the moment. Not a tactical breakthrough, not a flanking maneuver, but simply the weight of numbers overwhelming the capacity of the weapon, at which some German soldiers recognized that the landing was not going to be stopped. The battle for Omaha Beach lasted approximately 12 hours, from the first landings at 6:30 in the morning to the consolidation of the American position on the bluffs by late evening. By any historical measure, it was one of the most intense and costly engagements involving American forces in the entire Second World War. The men who crossed that beach, who survived the MG42 fire and the other weapons of the German defense, and who ultimately forced their way off the sand and onto the high ground, they did something that the morning's circumstances had made appear nearly impossible. The losses they took were real and were enormous, and the fact of those losses is the starting point for any honest account of what happened on June 6, 1944. Normandy today is a place of cemeteries and memorials. The American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, overlooking Omaha Beach, contains 9,388 graves arranged in rows that stretch across 22 hectares of ground above the beach where many of those men fell. The graves face west toward the United States, and on a clear day, you can see the water from the edges of the cemetery. The German cemetery at Lac Combe, a few kilometers inland, contains more than 21,000 graves, many of them marked with flat dark stone crosses rather than the white marble of the American site. The contrast between the two cemeteries, in design, in atmosphere, in what they communicate about how each side chose to memorialize its dead, is one of the more striking experiences available to anyone who visits the Normandy coast. The bunkers and fortifications on the bluffs above Omaha are still there. Some of them have been preserved as historical sites. You can walk into some of the concrete structures and stand at the firing slits and look down at the beach below and understand, immediately and viscerally, what the defensive position meant. The angle of fire, the field of view, the distance from the waterline to the base of the bluffs, all of it is still readable in the landscape, unchanged. What is not immediately readable in the landscape is the human experience of that morning. The veterans who could have described it are almost entirely gone now. D-Day survivors would be in their late 90s at youngest, and most of them died in the decades after the war. What they left behind in interviews, in memoirs, in testimony given to historians and documentary filmmakers constitutes one of the most extensive records of combat experience in history. But the record is finite, and as time passes, the primary witnesses become fewer, and the distance from that morning grows wider. The MG42 that was at the center of what happened on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, is now a museum piece and a historical artifact. Versions of it are displayed in military museums across Europe and the United States. Historians and enthusiasts study it. It appears in films and documentaries and games. Its rate of fire and its specifications are well known to anyone with an interest in military history. What those specifications meant on a specific beach on a specific morning, what they meant to the men coming off the landing craft ramps, and to the men behind the weapon looking down at them, is the thing that numbers and technical data cannot fully convey. It is the thing that the survivors spent decades trying to describe, and that the historical record, in all its detail, approaches but never entirely reaches. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.